Well, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this Diocese of Guildford webinar on maximising planned giving for your parish. It's wonderful to see so many colleagues and friends from across the diocese with us this afternoon. For those I haven't met, my name's David Senior. I'm the mission enabler responsible for stewardship and evangelism, also in local ministry as a priest at St. Paul's, Howell Hill. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to help us to take a step change in parish income. We are seeing some really exciting results from the Trust and Try campaign being run by parishes now across the diocese. And we want to focus particularly today on planned giving as being the principal source of parish finance for ministry and mission. We've, in the course of these webinars, had a whole series of different giving specialisms. We started by looking at the parish giving scheme, which plays such an important role in enabling regular giving, and of course has huge benefits because it takes the administration off the parish. The costs are covered by the diocese, and there's also an inflation-adjusted option which the majority of givers take, which is being a real benefit, we find. We also looked last week at securing more legacies, which is, alongside maximising planned giving, perhaps the biggest area of opportunity, and one where the church traditionally has been very diffident compared to a range of other charities, which are much more upfront in inviting those who support them to leave legacies. I really commend the recording on that webinar to you. Next week, we are looking at digital giving, that's online and contactless devices. And then next month, there will be a special webinar on capital projects for churches, how to fund new buildings and major refurbishments. I'm very grateful to be joined today by two people with a great deal to offer. Firstly, Jim Barker, who is from the National Giving Team. He is the Regional Giving Advisor covering the Southeast, and he is formerly the Director of Fundraising for the Church Mission Society, and also by our very own Joe Lambeth, Parish Support and Finance Officer here at the Diocese, who will guide us through some of the financial issues in response to questions later on in the webinar. But let me start with by sharing a presentation, if I may. What I'd like us to do in getting the afternoon started is to share with you some fascinating results from the National Giving Survey conducted by the National Church in parishes across the Church of England. Then I want to share the message, if you like, the core ask which we're supporting clergy in making of their congregations, an invitation to trust and try to trust the promises of Scripture, of God's faithfulness to those who give, and to try giving at a level which they have previously not thought possible. And then Jim will be taking us through how to plan and deliver a successful and well-structured annual stewardship campaign in your parish. Let me start with the National Giving Survey. Top 10 findings. Firstly, a third of Anglicans do not give to their church at all. That includes a third of those who come on a regular basis to church. A third don't give to their church. 40% have never been asked to give regularly. Nearly half have never been asked, having started giving, have never been asked actually to review their giving. Over half have heard a sermon on giving in the past 12 months, and 60% of these say it didn't make any difference. Of those who did, they say it didn't change their thinking on giving at all. So obviously focusing on messaging and teaching is going to be a key part of this campaign. Less than a third say that they are regularly thanked for their giving. And this is really foundational. Giving thanks to those who give is one of the basics of effective fundraising. And it is critically, it's amazing actually how an effective acknowledgement and thanking campaign in itself can help achieve a significant increase in giving. Most people think, well, I'll happily give to help keep the building maintained. There's the sense of the building, of the church being the building, rather than the church being the body of Christ being held in community. Real focus on buildings rather than on mission and ministry. Twice as many have been asked to give by collection envelope compared to direct debit or standing order. And Anglicans are 3 times as likely to leave a legacy to charity as they are to their church. And there are so many examples we've come across of very faithful church members who have gone to be with the Lord and then have left, in some cases, they've had no relatives and have left their home to a secular charity. These charities are, of course, do wonderful work, but there is not a recognition sufficiently that the ministry and mission of the church depends upon the local congregation. There's not a sufficient recognition that your parish needs funding. Certainly we find that when we get these messages over, it makes a huge difference. Only 27% of Anglicans viewed their church's financial need as very important, which is fascinating, isn't it? So there's sometimes a feeling that, oh, the government funds or churches or the diocese funds, or somebody must fund them. The fact that the church family supports the work of the church, it may be basic and foundational to us, but it's surprising how many of those who come along to church without knowing how the church is organized aren't actually aware. And in fact, the techniques we'll be talking about today are birthed in work of the Diocese of Southwark, which is, they developed a campaign called TRIO. The responsibility is ours, around communicating that it is the church family responsibility to fund the work of the church. And finally, and I do find this really encouraging, actually, 49% say that they would be motivated to give more if they understood the impact of their giving. Now, these findings are done, are national. They're and perhaps because my predecessors in this role at the diocese have been really effective, and I know parishes have been very effective. We've done a lot of work in our diocese. So I suspect if we ran it here, the figures would be more favourable. But they do show, actually, a really exciting opportunity. If every parish was already communicating in inspirational ways the need for giving, indeed the gospel imperative to give as a core part of stewardship, if we were doing all of that and people were still giving at relatively low levels, then you think, well, this is really very hard. But the beauty of what we've seen is that there is a communications challenge which we can address. If people don't understand these things, well, then we can communicate the reality, can't we? We can communicate both the role of giving as a core part of following Jesus, a core part of discipleship or formation, as some traditions prefer to term it. And of course, this needs to be led. It can be done, it can be achieved. We can see significant increases. We've seen instances of 20 or 30% increases in annual giving if we follow the process we're about to outline. Who should lead on this? The incumbent, the PCC, those of you who are in church leadership. Ultimately, it is the leadership of the church with the support of the finance team who have to truly embrace a successful campaign. We need a link to a compelling vision. That's why we're advocating an annual stewardship campaign linked to a sort of church development plan process or a revision of the plan or development of the plan. In other words, that you can stand up in front of the congregation and say, look, God is calling our church to be this and to do this in this context. And we would love to to seek your help in making this happen. With your giving, this is how our church is going to look. With this new minister, this new children's minister, this youth minister, whatever it is, these new facilities, this is the vision. It needs a planned communication and follow-up and ask to make sure that people, ideally by email, have a mechanism after you've asked them to respond. And the ask needs to be confident and bold. Sometimes there's a feeling of, I don't want to talk to the church about giving because it's, vicars will say, well, it's about my salary. Well, it isn't about giving to the church. It isn't about giving to you. It is about giving to the work of God through your parish. And we really want to encourage each other in this. We know it's a bit counterintuitive for those in our culture sometimes to be bold. But the key message, having thought and prayed about this over a period, the key message is that if we want to be full-on followers of Jesus, if we want to surrender everything to him, then we are called to follow his very clear teaching on opening our hands, holding lightly our money and other possessions, and communicating that through the priority that we give to giving to the work of God. And, if we fail to communicate that, then we fail to teach true followership of Jesus, I would argue. The Bible, of course, presents a detailed framework for generosity, that our giving to the work of God should be of our first fruits. So it is the first item in our budgets, not the last. We don't offer God the small change. We make sure that our giving, our tithing, or whatever is foundational, supported and guided by prayer, planned, intentional, proportionate, given in community. And if your church is blessed with a surplus, we would encourage people to give, rather than giving directly to other charities all the time, to give through the church, and for you as church to discern what other causes in the community, in the country, and internationally you would like to support. Giving needs to be sacrificial. And sometimes people say to me, well, I give sacrificially. I say, oh, what are you sacrificing? As we'll see, God doesn't always call in that sacrifice, but we must be trusting. And we are talking here today about significant levels of giving. We're not saying that tithing is legalistic and prescriptive, but we are talking about a substantial chunk of which many people will trust, will interpret as being tithing. Others will come up with different figures, but we are talking about a significant chunk of people's net income rather than a percentage or two, which is very often the case in the wider church. Giving cheerfully and joyfully, and if we can invest this campaign in a sense of we can do this, and celebration and joy at what God is doing, this miracle of money, then that will help to take away the feeling of obligation and awkwardness. When you come in and you give the results of the giving campaign, celebrating our giving, celebrating the outcomes, celebrating God's faithfulness, because when we give out, he gives in. And of course, it is very much a question of God looking on the heart rather than what we do individually. One question I find very important to ask parish congregations is, why did Jesus teach so much about money and possessions? Was he concerned about church fixed costs? No, he was concerned about our heart, and ultimately recognized that money and possessions have spiritual power, that we cannot serve two masters. And whilst, not everybody wants to try and be massively rich, although we're all rich by global standards, I would argue, there are many of us who feel really, I feel insecure, I feel worried, I can't trust God too much, I must be very cautious and sensible about my giving. And we want, through this campaign, to really challenge and to encourage that. The key message is one of breaking free. It's so easy to have that sense of fear. When I was young, I lived at home with my father, who he got hold of my bank statement on one occasion and said, "Son, you're overspending." And I said, "No, Dad, I'm under-earning," a distinction which he didn't find particularly persuasive. But he said, I remember him saying to me, "You'll come to want. You'll come to want." And I think for many of us, there is this fear of financial insecurity. Jesus comes to break chains, to set us free of these fears, doesn't he? And as we'll see from the promises in Scripture, he comes to help us to break free. And it is when we say, actually, I'm going to face down those fears, I am going to give radically and generously and cheerfully, that we achieve that freedom, and we grow in faith, and we sense more of his power and provision in our lives as we see him pouring in resources as we pour them out. There are express promises in Scripture of God's faithfulness to those who give generously. I particularly love preaching about 2 Corinthians 9. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each man should give what he's decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And then Paul gets even more blunt, actually, doesn't he? Express in what he says about those fearful of giving. He says, "He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness." And then he spells it out even further. "You will be enriched in every way, so that on every occasion you can be, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God." You will be enriched in every way. Now, I'm not preaching a prosperity gospel here. Clearly, God's blessing can take many different forms appropriate to our needs. Similarly, if we think, well, equities are kind of flatlining at the moment, I'm going to put money into God because I'm going to get a big financial return, then an omniscient God will see through that. But there are express promises, as we have seen in Scripture, that God will stand with those who give from a generous and sincere heart. And that has been the experience, I think we can say to our congregations, that has been the experience of faithful Christians down the ages. Billy Graham wrote this: "We have found in our own home, as have thousands of others, that God's blessing upon the 9/10 when we tithe helps it to go further than 10/10 without his blessing." John Wimber said, "In my long experience of Christian giving, God releases money to those whom he can trust to invest it in the kingdom." So the message, which seems to be resulting in some big increases in giving, which I'm happy to visit your parish to deliver, or to support your team in delivering, is trust and try. Trust the express promises of God and try giving it a level that you never thought possible. And I invite people to say, right, whoever corresponds with you on your giving, perhaps it's the treasurer or member of the finance team, just write to them and say, look, this is not a contractual commitment enforceable at law. This is, but I'm going to try giving at a level that I never thought possible, and I'm going to see what happens. And then, I very often go back to a church and see what's happened. And people never say, "Oh, I really regret giving at a substantial level," because, of course, we cannot outgive God. And it is amazing what we are seeing happen. The way that we want to put this invitation and support you in putting this invitation is in terms of next steps. It's saying to those who don't give regularly, or just give through the plate or whatever, if you are a regular worshipper here, if you consider our church to be your home, we need you to be a member of the regular giving family. We need to know each month, if we're to deliver this exciting plan, we need to know what's coming in each month. So take the first step. Doesn't matter how much you give initially, but become a regular giver. If you have been giving on a planned basis for a while, then we invite you to take your next step. Just as we grow in faith, just as we're called to take the next step, to move from milk to meat or whatever, we're called to take the next step in our giving. We're called to keep growing, to keep moving. And we're enabled to do this through the experience that we get when we give, because when we give, we experience, there's a real joy, a genuine joy associated with facing down our fears and giving generously. And when we see God's faithfulness, then we have the confidence and the faith to take the next step in our giving journey. So I would say to our congregation, if you haven't taken the first step on being a planned giver, take that step. If you've already been giving for a while, thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. We invite you now prayerfully to take that next step. And if they have frankly been giving at a very modest level, then we should not hesitate to say that for some that will involve doubling or trebling what you give to your church. Trust and try, and you will experience God's faithfulness in this. At that point, I'm going to hand over to Jim Barker. Jim, really grateful to have your support today, your support for me personally in this role, and for all you do for my colleagues across the southeast of England. Jim.
Thank you, David, and welcome. Thanks to everyone for your hospitality and welcoming me to talk with you today. So I will now share my screen and talk us through what are the steps we need to take in building a stewardship campaign and building planned giving. So that's what I'll be talking through with you. I'll just share this and kick this off. Good. So you should be seeing now one screen, which is blank at the moment, and it says Building a Generous Church. What I'm going to be doing here is talking you through some of the principles as well behind the stewardship campaign as we see it from the national giving team's perspective and from the work that we did following on from the National Giving Survey to build our strategy of how we worked as a team. So there are two things that I want to talk about in regard to building a generous church, and they're two acronyms. The first acronym is MINT, and the second acronym is IDEA, and I'll be talking these through with you as we go through. Also, any information I'm talking to you about in regard to building a national church can be found at our website, which is at the bottom of the screen now, which is rather long and complex. The easier thing to do is simply to Google Building a Generous Church. So if you want to follow up from anything I've talked about today, then the website to visit is the Building a Generous Church website, which is part of the Church of England's website structure. So if you just Google Building a Generous Church, you'll be able to find that hunky-dory. Okay, let me talk about these two things. First, I'm going to talk about IDEA. And IDEA stands for Inspire, Disciple, Embed, and Activate. And this is about how do we foster generosity within our churches and congregations. So encouraging generosity. First word, inspire, which is how do we inspire people through generous leadership and celebrating generosity within the life of our church. Whatever we're doing to get people on board with us in generosity needs to come as part of the activity that we do as leaders within our churches. And we have to inspire people through our generous leadership in what we're doing. We can't expect others to follow unless we're living this out ourselves and they're following, therefore, from example on us. But we also want to disciple members so they can grow in their understanding of God's generosity toward them so they can live generous lives. So having that theological understanding of why we're talking about generosity, which David talked about in all those scriptures, where God's talking about how we use resources and how resources were given to us from God, how God has been generous to us in our lives. Our generosity comes out of that place. And that's a really important part to understand in terms of their own journey in discipleship. And then we embed generosity in the life of the church through its plans, services, and ministries. So therefore, generosity is something, yes, it's important that we do it and that we plan for it and perhaps once a year, but also look for those opportunities where we can embed generosity throughout the year in what we do. So we talk about giving and generosity and the church's roles and responsibilities within that through the year. So it becomes part of the habit if you like, that we're doing within our churches. And then the last thing is about activating that generosity. It's great to talk about these things, but how do we provide opportunities for people to grow in generosity and apply what they've discovered? So move forward to that step of action and activity in what they're doing. How can they act on what it is that we're asking them to do? So IDEA is about this thing of encouraging generosity. Next acronym is MINT, which follows on from IDEA nicely. IDEA, if you like, just going back one step, is about building a culture of generosity within our churches. The next one, which is Mechanism, Impact, Need and Trust, or MINT, is around how, therefore, do we enable giving, which follows on from IDEA because it's about how then do we activate what we're doing. Having the right mechanisms for giving, such as direct debits, contactless online, legacies and gift aid, etc., is obviously a really important thing. One of the dangers that we have within my team and people like David, who I support as giving advisors in diocese, we come across all the time is people believing if we've got the right mechanism, it does everything for us. Mechanism is really important. In other words, having the right things in place to enable people to give is great. And I'll talk a little bit more about these as we go through. But it's only one part of the picture. People can become very disappointed if they introduce a new mechanism, but they don't see the growth in giving that they'd expect because they don't then move on to look at the other things that they need to put in place. The next one I'll put it together, which is showing people the impact that their giving has and how that enables the church's mission and ministry, and explaining the need for people to give. That's really critical in building, therefore, how people can live out and enable that giving. When people understand the impact their giving has and they understand their need to give, that's really quite critical for them. That really dovetails well into what David was talking about in terms of communicating the vision of the church. Both the impact and the need are points of communication with the vision of what it is your church wants to do. And I work with churches all over the south of England, and that range of needs and impacts they have is quite diverse. I've got congregations I work with who are very cool in what they do. And therefore, actually the community that they're part of really values that core tradition of the church, but they need to understand for that core tradition to continue, they need people to give to that. And I have churches, on the other hand, who work in very poor areas where they're sole provider of a food bank and often debt counselling services. That's at the other end of the spectrum, if you like. But those, again, that talks about the impact and the need that's there and why people need to give to support those pieces of work. And the last one is really around building trust so that people have the confidence the church will spend their gifts wisely and well. We have to build trust through thanking and through telling people what we've done with their donations, what difference their support has made, and then how that's been spent and how the church stewards their money and the resources that has been given to it. So that's really important. Moving on from there, we're specifically going to look at how to build or planning to build your plan giving. So what planning do we need to do to build our own plan giving within churches? And for today, I'm going to give you 3 simple steps. 3 steps. One is set up your mechanism. I've talked about mechanisms before as MINT. You've got to know what your mechanism is within your church. The second is make an ask. How do you make an ask and what's involved in that? And the third thing, really critically, is around following up from that. And what do we do as a result, and how do we ensure we do good follow-up? So the first one, have your system or mechanism set up. Many of you will have heard the parish giving scheme. It's a fantastic scheme that's there that the diocese has signed up for. So you can sign up for that as a church and sign people into the parish giving scheme, which is a direct debit giving system. What's beautiful about that is it enables you to work with a simplified system that's already there for you. There's forms that already exist. Gift aid is claimed on your behalf and it reduces the administration that's there for you. But some people already have a standing order system that they're happy with. If that's the case, go with it. Work with whatever works for you in terms of that system that you've got. Some people use other systems as well, but we'll just share that with you. So have your system and mechanism set up and be confident with that, knowing the forms that you've got and how that works. And that's great. The second point is knowing how you're going to make your ask. So 3 things here. One way you can do that is through something called Generosity Week. So as a national church, we run Generosity Week. We run it every September. It roughly links in with Harvest, but in that week, we provide churches with resources and sermon outlines and things for young people to do, which are built around generosity. So therefore you can hang your ask off that generosity week and those things. You can hang your ask off a harvest week, whatever it is, or you might hang it off the first service in the New Year's, whatever works for you as a church. But plan for how you're going to make that ask, what you're going to frame it around, and how that's going to work for you in your church. In Generosity Week, we have that hanging off 2 weekends. So it's slightly longer than a week. So therefore, it enables an opportunity to be able to do 2 asks within that framework, 1 on each Sunday. And of course, that would depend on how many services you have as well. But knowing that you're going to do it then, and this is what you're going to hang it off, is really important to be able to plan for what you're doing. The next is when you can't find the words to make that ask. We're really conscious of a team. It's really difficult for some people to find the words to make an ask. We live in a culture that's very difficult and very shy about asking for money. And we live in a culture where we're not actually prepared to do that. I've got friends and colleagues who work in America, and there's a very different culture around giving in that. So I'm going to give you a set of words. The set of words have been very helpfully provided for us in the sermon by Dr. Sam Wells. Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who's the vicar of St. Martin in the Fields on Trafalgar Square in London. I'm going to read this out to you because I think this is brilliant wording for us as Anglicans in England. I think the way it's framed is lovely. And what he says in this sermon, and do not be afraid to crib these words. He says, if you don't give because no one's ever asked you, I'm asking you now. If you don't give regularly because you've never got round to it, I'm saying today's the day. If you don't give much because you think St. Martin's, and you can replace your own church name there, doesn't need it, I'm telling you that it does. If you don't give a lot because you don't have a lot, I'm saying your giving is something, your giving something is an example to everyone else. If you don't give more because no one's ever said thank you, I'm thanking you right now. If you already give until the pips squeak, I'm saying that's wonderful, and nudge the person next to you to do the same. So it couches all of those examples, all those things that we know ourselves. Within our congregations, we have people who are giving out to the max, and we have people who aren't giving because they've never been asked. And here's a lovely quote for you to be able to drop into a sermon at the end of a sermon around giving and asking, and that really enables somebody else's words to take that pain out of the ask. And that's therefore, if you search Sam Wells and generosity, then there's a whole sermon that he gave, which is a really lovely outline for you as well. Okay, last thing is around follow-up. Every generic ask needs to be followed up with a specific request. So we would really encourage you, once you've done a generic ask to a congregation, email everyone that you know was present and ask them, I do a specific ask for them. You don't have to ask an amount. You just go in and say, thank you so much for being there yesterday or earlier today. It would be really helpful if you were able, or however you want to phrase this, it would be so wonderful if you're able to kind of continue to support your church in this way by giving in this format, whichever that works for you. And it's a specific ask for somebody so that they know that they've been asked and that sits with them. And that's really important. One of the things that we know often is when a generic ask going out, it can often slip that person. They know they've been asked at one level, but it hasn't come to them specifically. So we would really ask you to follow that up with a specific ask to individuals as well. If you were hanging this campaign off a week that you were doing, as said, over Generosity Week or over Harvest, then do it at the end of that, saying, following up from this is what we're asking people to do, and I'm asking you to do this today. Or at least I'm asking you to consider doing this today. Again, find the language that's going to work within your congregation. That's important. I said there were 3 steps that aren't, there's 4. And this is around thanking. Thanking is a really important aspect of what we do. I've worked in fundraising now for over 30 years. And thanking is one of the most contentious issues, because a lot of people will tell you, I don't want to be thanked for my gift. But the anthropologist Margaret Mead tells us something quite interesting when she said, what people say they want, what they want, and what they actually do with their wants are 3 very different things. I've got colleagues who've worked in organizations, and the first thing they didn't change anything that organization was doing. They simply changed the process by which people were thanked for their donations. and they've increased that giving to that organization by 50% overnight. Because we might say to ourselves, I don't need thanking, or I don't want thanking, but the truth is we all love to be thanked. We love to be appreciated. It's really important that we thank people in any kind of campaign that we're doing for anything that they're doing, so that they feel appreciated and part of what it is that we do. I'll stop sharing now. So thinking about how you're going to be running your campaign, think about those 3 or 4 simple steps of what you're going to be doing. Think about having your mechanism in place, whatever that is. Think about how you're going to frame that ask and what you're going to be able to do that with. Ensure that you follow up that ask with a specific ask to people and thank people for what they're doing. It's 4 relatively simple things that we're asking you to do. Most of it hangs off planning that you're used to doing within your churches anyway. You've just got to find a theme for your week. And I would suggest, the generosity week is a great place to start for you. Even if you're simply thinking about doing something and you don't think it's exactly like that, it gives you the framework for something to work from. And if you find it hard to find the words to ask, just nick the words from Sam Wells. It's a nice framing way saying, rather than saying it yourself, you're using somebody else's words to say it, but it will still have the same impact. So I'll stop blabbering on now, and we're going to hopefully have some time for questions, and we'll be able to kind of bounce a conversation between ourselves. David, thank you.
Jim, thank you very much. That was really concise and powerful and comprehensive. So thank you so much. I think with 41 of us on the call at the moment, probably the chat is going to be the best mechanism for putting your questions to make sure that we don't miss anybody. So if you can start to type in your questions, that would be wonderful. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask Jim just to encourage us, when parishes, in your experience, move from either fairly not having an annual stewardship campaign and having pretty limited kind of focused asks of this sort, and they move and they introduce this, what kind of change in total giving do you think is achievable in many of the instances that you work with?
Yeah, good. That's a really good question. And it really is, it's quite broad in terms of seeing that change, because different people have approached it in different ways. The more you can structure something around what you're doing, the more intentional you can be, then the bigger the impact is that you have. So we see some congregations, suddenly growing up to almost, within a few months of doing a giving campaign, increasing their giving by, £2,000 or £3,000 a month, simply because the size of the congregation that was there, they'd not really thought about doing this before. And a good example I know is a congregation based in the South Midlands, I'll say that as much, an area I used to live in, where the church was hugely dependent on retail lettings, because they owned a large street in the town or city they were in, and there was a lot of retail settings in that. And that retail letting suddenly dropped in terms of the income, and they needed to turn to the church. And it was a wake-up call to the church. They'd really not done much giving, but it was an active church with a congregation of nearly 200 people. And they, a lot of the people in that congregation had never been asked to give before, because the need wasn't perceived to be there, because they had this other income stream that had been reliable. And within a short period of time, they had congregation, they had giving of up to £2,000, £3,000 a month coming in. So again, it really does depend on the context of what's happening and the effort that people put behind it.
That's really helpful, thank you. And of course, it's so easy as well to change giving levels, isn't it? I was preaching at St Saviour's a few weeks back in Guildford, and at the end, the treasurer said several people had been online during the sermon, and one person came up to me and said, while you were talking, I increased my giving by £3,000, and that's one person. It shows that people do respond to this kind of approach. Now, thankfully, I thought the only question was going to be a request for the slides, which will be circulated certainly. And sorry if they weren't viewable on your screen, Jamie. Right, Chris, when we're faced with questions about where the parishioners' money goes, what is the best way to answer us this? Several of our givers have raised concerns about how their money is spent by the diocese. Well, I'm going to say a couple of things about this, and then I'm going to bring in Jo. Jo is the expert on parish share.
Yes, so parish share, that's going to be, for most parishes, probably the biggest part of their expenses. And what that's made up of is an amount that we pay towards your vicar's stipend. So that's the stipend, the on-cost, which is pension, national insurance, and a few other little bits as well. And within the stipend costs, there's an amount that goes towards training new vicars, and then I think that's about 47 this year, and then there's about 17,000 that goes on housing. And on the housing, you've got the council tax, the work that's done on the properties. Then you have the property team that organise all the work around the properties, and also, again, a little bit of training for vicars in the future. So just to have a vicar, every parish will pay exactly the same. If you have one full-time vicar, you will pay about 63,000 a year for the stipend and the housing. The next bit that goes on top of that is your shared costs. Now that includes, again, not training the vicars necessarily, but the bigger training picture, the mission enablers, church house. Also, there's a contribution that Guildford Diocese make, being one of the richer dioceses, as a contribution. It's not that much, but that goes to National Church to help with the dioceses that are less wealthy. And that is made up of your a combination of attendance numbers and affluence factor. So when people ask, where's my parish share going? Well, it's going to pay for your vicar, to pay for his housing, to pay for the training of new vicars. So probably the next one to take over from your current vicar, you're paying for that training. And also a share of the central costs, like safeguarding costs, the mission team, and another sort of the finance team and the HR team here as well.
Thank you, Jo. And Jo's very kindly given me 3 slides, which I think will be helpful in responding to any questions you may get about parish share. I'm adding these to the record, as it were. Firstly, let's look at total diocesan spend. Where does the money received through parish share, how is it spent by the diocese? And as you'll see from this total breakdown, which incidentally is based on last year's budget, but so the odd percentage point may have changed year on year, but gives the overall picture, from which you will see that the bulk of spending goes on local clergy. Clergy stipends account for nearly half of diocesan spend at 49%, clergy housing a further 14%, 4% on other clergy and parish support, 10% goes to the National Church and Ordinands, and helps support the ministry of the Church of England in some of the poorest parts of our country. 16% of total spend for the diocese, 1/6, goes on the central team, which of course includes here key roles like safeguarding, having a diocesan director of Ordinands, supporting you in your mission, and is helped through the fact that we can get some funding from elsewhere, and where we do, we can. Where we do. So, for instance, some of the education team is statutorily funded, and our own area of mission where we get support from the church commissioners. So support for the revitalisation programme, for instance. And my own role in supporting parishes in giving is in part funded by the church commissioners through the National Giving Strategy. So that's the total picture. In terms of what an individual parish actually pays, as Joe was saying, it's a combination of ministry costs and shared costs. For the ministry costs are the same and are based on actuals aggregated across the whole diocese, are the same for every vicar, every incumbent. Total of around £63,000, which are the actuals based on stipend, NI, pension, training of next vicars, housing, maintenance of housing, and council tax. And then the shared costs, the other costs that we were talking about a moment ago, are divided according to the size of your congregation and whether your parish is relatively affluent compared to the rest of those in the Guildford area, or less so, the Guildford diocese, or less so. A final point on this is that we as a diocese, and we're all in this together, are totally reliant on parish share in order to meet the costs of continued ministry. Because as you'll see from this graph, if you look at Guildford on the left in orange, we rely on parish share, which accounts for 94% of income, much more than in the case of other dioceses. Because as you will see, if you look towards the right, the other dioceses which were formed, we were formed in the 1920s, the other dioceses would go back hundreds of years in many cases, and they have holdings of land and other assets which generate income. So they aren't and they have reserves which we don't have. So they aren't as totally reliant on parish share as we are. It's an irony that as an area of the country, the Guildford diocese geographical area, as an economic area, is one of the most, if not the most prosperous diocese in the country. But as a church organisation, the legal entity, which is the Diocesan Board of Finance, is actually just about the poorest in the country, which is why what you invest through parish share is so critical to continued ministry here. Finally, can I say, we had debates in the past about, for instance, how shared costs are allocated, and there are all sorts of different formulae, whatever. My role, and what I want to support your incumbent and your finance team and your PCC and your congregation in doing, my role is to help us all to grow the cake, to grow total giving so that we can meet these costs and generate a surplus to invest in kingdom growth across our diocese. I hope that's helpful. Let me move to Judith Alford. Can we expect church members to tithe the income for the benefit of the church when many already give sacrificially to other Christian charities? And I'm going to say a couple of things, and I'm going to bring Jim in if I may. Firstly, I think nobody would say that the tithe is a precise legal obligation, but against God's overwhelming, in response to God's overwhelming generosity to us in Christ, we are looking at challenging everybody to give a substantial proportion of their income, particularly since God promises his faithfulness to those who give. And in some cases, I interviewed the Archbishop of York, the last one, John St. Armu, about this on Premier, and he was going, well, actually, my wife and I give 20%. We don't want to be completely formulaic about this. People will be called by God to give different things in different circumstances. It's good that church members give to Christian causes. Certainly, that's a key message because, small furry animals deserve protection, but there are 60 million people out there who can potentially give to that cause. So we need to encourage our people to give to Christian causes. And certainly within this diocese, we do encourage giving to the church and giving through the church. I think for it to be a community exercise where people give into the church, and where if there is a surplus that you can give on to other charities, where you discern God's will together and do that collectively and bless the neighbouring community. So let us encourage people to focus their giving on the parish insofar as it is possible. Jim, what's your perspective on this?
Thank you, David. I think I would endorse everything you've said there as well. I think it's really tied into this issue of people don't perceive this being a need in the parish. So I think it really ties in with this thing of what's the need that's being done, what's the impact of the work that's happening within the parish. I've come across so many cases when that's been pointed out to people or framed for people in the right way. They've gone, oh, I've never seen it like that. And actually, because of the relational strength that sits at the parish level that we have within our churches, it's a really strong, compelling thing that people will then kind of reallocate what their giving is and say, actually, yeah, I do want to continue to support the parish as well as these other causes that I have. But often it comes down to a thing that people haven't been asked, or that hasn't, the need and the impact thing that's happening in the parish hasn't been communicated to them, so it hasn't really sunk in that way. So, and that's something we come across quite frequently. We know, and the Anglican Giving Survey says this loud and clear, that Anglicans are very generous, Anglican Christians are very generous in terms of what they give, but often they're not giving to the church simply because the need hasn't been highlighted to them. So it's a case of how do you do that? And I think that comes into this thing of David saying, what's the vision? What's the thing that you're doing in your parish that really speaks to the needs that's happening in the parish? And being able to communicate that to that people, communicating that well to people.
And indeed, this methodology, a lot of it grew out of something done in the Diocese of Southwark called TRIO, The Responsibility is Ours. And it is surprising how many of those, particularly if they aren't core members of a congregation or are particularly aware of how the Church of England works, there's an assumption that there's a rich diocese out there that pays for the church. Well, of course, there isn't, as you know, and actually we are one of the few dioceses with actually no reserves, liquidatable reserves that we can use for this for the purpose. So it's actually straight in, straight out. People don't realise that the government doesn't pay, or the council doesn't pay, that the church congregation needs to pay the costs if you want your church to develop and to grow. So thank you, really helpful. Howard, your comment about one great source is to encourage people to tithe legacies that they receive. Well, that's an interesting thought, yes, rather than waiting for death. And of course, do look at Eleanor Stead's brilliant, I'll send you the link, brilliant thing on this. Frankly, it's planned giving and legacies. They're the two really big things. Just a real encouragement to focus on that, on receiving more legacies. If you think of the weight of marketing materials that your parishioners will be receiving from other charities that they support, and they'll be quite happy about that. We don't do a tenth of the effort that others do. So there is a massive opportunity. And of course, it's key to make sure you have a legacy policy in place so that if you do, when your legacies do come in, they don't just go into the general fund and then depress giving. Those who've stopped earning and retired earning, are concerned with care costs later in life. We aren't asking anybody to put themselves in serious financial difficulty here. We are looking at a scenario, I think, across our diocese where giving across the Church of England, not just to regular givers, is probably not much in excess of 1% of net income. And within that, there are a lot of people who do have the capacity to reprioritize holidays, new cars, whatever else it is, patios, and it's those people who have a degree of margin where we're saying, if you seek to follow Jesus wholeheartedly and to grow in faith, that needs to be reflected in our priorities in all that we do. We cannot say all for Jesus, except for my money or my career or my relationships or whatever. And I say it's a message that we need to encourage clergy to put confidently. I'm happy to help wherever possible and to visit any, I've visited about 20 parishes on Sundays so far, really happy to support you in whatever level is required in encouraging people in this bold ask. So thank you, Nick. Good question. Alan, your question, is there an ideal target ratio for planned income relative to other income in a parish? No, there isn't, because obviously we want to see all sources of income maximised. If you have trading income from letting halls, etc., wonderful, so long as you don't let them so much that you inhibit the ministry of your church, because there's never any space available for new parish ministries. Diane, yes, you'll get a copy of the legacy recording. We've had a lot of pushback, says Peter, based on the church commissioners finding 100 million down the back of a sofa. Many people are suspicious of our asks. Jim, I'm going to let you open on this one.
Thank you. Good. I'll come back on that one as well. So suspicious on the number of asks. I think there is there's clearly a relationship here between spending and income, and this comes back into this thing of how do we build trust in what's going on. You know, completely support everything that's been said in regard to transparency in terms of communication. That really does work well in that regard. A couple of things that I would say around a couple of other questions as well, which is that some people have said around the balance of activities for income, and some people have raised the question of the collection plate. If you go into and search on building a generous church, there's one thing you can do there, which is a giving audit. And in that giving audit, one of the questions I think it will present you with is searching for 3 numbers in your churches, which is if you can look at the numbers of people you've got as regular attendees on a Sunday, on your average service, how many people are signed up to your electoral roll, and how many people have you got signed up onto a regular giving pattern of any kind. I can't tell you, if you look at those 3 numbers and what the balance is, I can't tell you what the balance should be, but you can look at those 3 numbers and you can discern a little bit of what's going on. Because I've worked with churches that have looked at the numbers, they're getting 150 people in the congregation on a Sunday. They've got 200 signed up for the electoral roll because it's a church in quite a kind of a large village, and there's lots of people who kind of joined in with that. And they might have 5 people who are regular giving, in which case that's saying there's something out of kilter with that. But if you look at those 3 numbers, that will give you a starting point to say what's happening in regard to regular giving and what therefore do we need to build. So I'd look at that as one way. The other thing that in regard to doing it's been put on the questions as well is some people have stopped circulating the plate completely. And I think that's something I would encourage you to do if you think it's the right thing to do. But again, look at what the balance of activity in your church is. So the giving audit will tell you what's going on, you know, because it might be you're circulating the plate, but in a cashless society where people are turning up, you know, I don't know about you, but anytime I turn up somewhere and it's asked for cash, I'm scrabbling around to my spouse and friends to see who's got cash because we just don't carry it around anymore. So is the plate really an effective thing to do now? You should be asking those kind of questions alongside it. I'll stop there on my little kind of rattle away with those things.
No, I think that's really helpful, Jim. And if you think about it, if we're talking about somebody giving even sort of 5% of net income, let's say that could be £2,000 or £3,000 a year or something, then if they only come to church, as many do now, twice a month, then you're looking at a huge amount of money being put in the plate, or a huge digital contribution being made. And people would not give at that level. You know, you'd be looking at hundreds of pounds per church visit. So that is why it is so important to move from plate collections, be they cash or digital, to move as many people as we can onto planned giving. Another quick addition to the recording from me: a question was raised about £100 million investment from the Church of England announced earlier this year, and the ways in which it had been reported in the press. And I agreed to come back with, we didn't address it properly during the webinar, so I agreed to come back with some further comments. This related to the decision of the Church Commissioners announced in January to establish an impact investment fund to the value of £100 million to, and I'm quoting here, to invest in a better and fairer future for all, particularly for communities affected by historic slavery. This follows a period of research which established that the Church Commissioner's predecessor body had knowingly and substantially benefited from investment in transatlantic slavery, and the deliberations of a group set up under the chairmanship of the Right Reverend David Uckett to develop the Church of England's response. The decision was taken to set up this £100 million fund and to invite other statutory and grant-making funders to come in alongside the Church of England to establish a fund which will generate an income which can be used to make grants for, again I quote, projects focused on improving opportunities for communities impacted by historic transatlantic chattel slavery. And of course, the hope will be that the Worldwide Church will be amongst the organisations applying for those grants in order to run local projects in territories affected by transatlantic slavery. The fund will also be used to fund research, further research into the Church Commissioner's history, and again I quote, supporting dioceses and parishes to research and address their historic links with transatlantic slavery, and sharing best practice with other organisations researching their slavery legacies. They add the Church Commissioners will also continue to use its voice as a responsible investor to address and combat modern slavery. There was a range of press reaction. Some commentators said, well, this doesn't go far enough. It represents only part of the value of the gain made out of investment in slavery. Others have said, well, why are we doing this? Here's a quote from the church. This is all I can do is to share with you a quote from the Archbishop of Canterbury, who said, it is hard to do this, to make this investment at a time when resources in many parishes are so stretched, but by acting rightly, we open ourselves to the blessing of God.
I raised my hand electronically earlier. It was only, I haven't been at a church that has a collection plate for a long time. However, I think we're missing an opportunity to model generosity to our children. They don't see our giving by parish share and I have young children myself, and it's really hard to get them to see how they can give a little bit of their pocket money at this stage so that in the future they're giving their tithe. So that's a challenge for us to sort of mull on, I guess.
Thank you, Dawn. I'll chat with Emma, my colleague who looks after children's ministry, on that. Certainly you're doing the right thing in encouraging your children at the early stage, not to see everything in their pocket money, whatever, as being theirs to spend, and part of it as being to return to God. And bless you in that, Dawn. Thank you.
I was just going to jump in. Sorry, this is a really useful session. Thank you to everybody involved, and apologies for several questions. One very quick one from me. Any thoughts on how to help people contextualize the amount they give in comparison to others? Because one of the issues we've had is that obviously for a long time we've had the policy of not sharing with the vicar, or indeed with many people at all, any information about how much individuals are giving, and obviously for good reason, because that is a private matter, a confidential matter. But I think the problem comes when people don't necessarily have any sense of where they could or should pitch themselves, and sometimes it helps to have a sort of benchmark in comparison to other people. So any comments on how to tactfully share information with the congregation about levels of giving, or if that's even
very helpful, Chris. No, very helpful. If I can launch in on that to start with, I think what we do in our own church is to give information on giving bands, and certainly giving proportions. In other words, we would say, as is in many cases, a large proportion of the church's costs is met by a small number of very generous people, and that's unsustainable and that's wrong. And so enabling people to see that is the situation. Looking at average giving levels can be a bit meaningless because they are so distorted by the minority of people who give at a very substantial level. or give at a very high proportional level. Some of the dangers in looking at absolute giving levels is people think, well, oh, well, if the average Church of England giving is sort of, I don't know, £5 a week or whatever, that's fine. I'm doing that and it's okay. We are looking at overall giving levels, which are far below the biblical mandate, and which are far below the required level to sustain our parishes, let alone to invest in mission and growth. Jim, what's your advice on that?
I hope this doesn't sound like I'm contradicting David. I'd agree with all of that. I would say that the averages can be a helpful guide. Just, you wouldn't necessarily kind of push them out there, but look at what the average giving is within the congregation. And also remember, going back to our maths lessons, mean, median and mode. So the mean is the average, which can be distorted by the very high givers. The median is the one that, if you line them all up together, sits in the middle. That can be quite a helpful guide for you to give you some kind of sense to ask, and that can be helpful. We've got, and I can get these figures for David, those churches who are members of the parish giving scheme, we can find out those median figures for you across the diocese. And again, wouldn't necessarily use that, but that's something to help, that might help you, give you some kind of guide as to what we do. And also, I think I would also pull down, if you've got a number of people on the PCC who are happy to share what they give, then the more we can be transparent as well and push towards transparency, that can help as well. And saying, you know, amongst the PCC, there's a few of us that we can give at this kind of level. You don't have to be specific, but to give some kind of indicators might be helpful. You might want to do that in a way which is, you do that in a safer environment than in front of the whole congregation. And think about the forms in which you do that. Small groups forms can be more helpful to do that in.
Indeed, and that's a very helpful distinction, Jim. Certainly, I was saying that obviously, as leaders in your churches and as members of the stewardship teams, we can give you all those figures. And I think we're talking about the dangers sometimes of letting people in the congregation feel, oh, well, I'm kind of doing the average, so I'm kind of okay. Perhaps in circumstances where the congregational giving as a whole is at a level which is capable of being increased substantially. At that point, I'm going to say a word of prayer. I'm also going to circulate the slides and this recording. Great to have you with us. I'll be in touch by email and would love to visit as many parishes as we can. It's been a great pleasure being involved in this role so far. God bless. Enjoy the rest of your day.